Kia ora tātou, everybody. As a former English teacher, I do like to indulge in a little bit of alliteration from time to time. I'm not averse to a little verse, but I'll spare you that today. Now, I'm not sure why I'm here at all. I retired nearly 20 years ago, and it's good of you to ask me to speak again. But I have this peculiar fascination for international surveys of achievement and the sort of patterns that they expose. I'm not less interested in the rankings so much as the other sort of comparisons you can make between policies that are common to a few countries and not to others. And I think you can learn quite a lot if you get into the data. And I've had that view ever since I was talked into chairing the steering committee of an IEA survey of literacy in 32 countries back in 1990. And I saw the inside of some of these surveys. They've got potential. Initially I was skeptical, but once I got involved, I found that they'd learned quite a lot about how to make them work. And although I know Pisa comes in for a lot of criticism, but I've got a bit more confidence in it, and particularly in the way I'm going to use it. That's the particular team that I was looking after back in 1990 when we did the IEA survey of literacy. And we met mostly in Europe, and there are the 32 delegates that we had to sort of get agreement from, and it was a pretty democratic sort of process to finish up with what we had in the end. Now, I like Martin, I do believe OECD is getting too much influence, and Andreas Schleicher shouldn't be endorsing our government's policy investing for educational success when it was so controversial to come in the first place. And the recent OECD report said some very nice things about NCA and national standards that I think that report was very biased, and it drew strong criticism from me as reported in the Listener. Now, those of you who know me will probably realise that I've long had a suspicion of standards-based assessment. No, that's an understatement. I've long been struck off the Christmas card list of the Ministry of Education and NZQA because of my dogged opposition to standards-based assessment. Not always, just in high-stakes situations, and that's where it's being used at the moment. Why? Well, I'll give you my reasons. I think that standards-based assessment can be useful used informally in classrooms, feedback for teachers and so on. So I'm not always opposed to it. But what have we learned from Pisa this time? As you know, the New Zealand 15-year-olds slumped a long way down from one of the top nations in the OECD to merely average, just between the years 2000 and 2012. Meanwhile, Hikai Parata, as you know, boasts that we're improving in NCA every year and things are getting better and better, which I think is nonsense. Does our decline matter? Of course it does. Any apparent deterioration in the quality of education in New Zealand should be of concern to QPEC, whether it's real or apparent. If our politicians want to move the system to the right, to privatise and to adopt more charter schools and business models and so on, all they have to do is show that our once successful liberal public education system is not working, and they'll get a sympathetic ear from the voters. In my view, the business model of accountability that's already grown up in New Zealand is failing, and we don't want it anymore. Now, When the results came out last year, the media highlighted bad news, of course, as they usually do, and the Minister has accepted it, that we witnessed an unusually steep decline in Pisa in 2012. Can you remember when we were flying high, when we were one of those rock star education systems? There's the IEA survey of 14-year-olds back in 1970. On the very left of the graph, that's New Zealand. We were even ahead of Finland. Then 20 years later, in the survey that I had responsibility for, we were still up near the top. That's New Zealand fourth from the left. Finland has come through to the top at that point. And again, we were being praised by educators around the world, and teachers were beating a path to our door to try and find out what our secrets were. It was all going fine. And in that particular survey, we demonstrated that New Zealand had the highest percentage of good readers, that is, scoring over a mark of 600 on a scale where the average is 500. That's New Zealand, the tall one towards the right there. That was something we were quite proud of. Then in the first year of Pisa, in 2000, we again shone brightly in each subject tested. There were 3 subjects, reading, maths and science. And we were third highest in reading and maths and 6th in science. And again, we had the most top readers in the country. 19% of our best readers, above the cut-off point for the best readers, and the international average was only 10%. So our Minister of Education, Trevor Mallard at the time, put out this media statement. I've just shown the heading of it there. New Zealand students on top of the world. And he was boasting about how well our teachers perform. And unfortunately, the media didn't pick it up as well as they should, in my opinion. They a little sceptical, I suppose, about how good our education system is. And so some of us academics wrote articles where we tried to get them to the public to see that our teachers are doing a great job. So that's one that I had printed in the Herald. Why aren't we celebrating our international success in education, asked Warwick Elley. And amongst other comparisons, this year we proclaimed our All Blacks as heroes for shutting out South Africa, Australia and each of the UK teams. But so did our 15-year-old students. Did anyone notice? And other points of that form. So now that was all before standards-based assessment came along. That was in the form of NCA, and I was an early critic. I must say, I regard tests as very blunt instruments, and it's possible to manipulate them if you know how. And I've developed lots of tests over time, and you can prepare hard questions on easy material and easy questions on hard material, and you can bring about all kinds of changes if you really try. So in my opinion, back in 1993, the Qualifications Authority was already planning a recipe for assessment chaos, and I still stick to that view. So how well the students who are assessed on high-stakes standards-based assessment perform in Pisa? Well, I've worked in a lot of different countries around the world. I've been lucky enough to get positions in different places. And I like to study the assessment policies of different countries. And as far as I can see, and I've checked quite a lot of different authorities, 7 of the 65 systems that are participating in Pisa have adopted standards-based assessment, like our NCA, and they've published their results in the form of league tables, making it all very high stakes, okay? Now, those 7 countries are England, USA, Sweden, Netherlands, Ontario, Australia, and New Zealand. They're all specifying, as John pointed out this morning in the first talk, they're specifying measurable objectives and getting teachers to evaluate their children, their students, in relation to those objectives. I was in England in 1989 when the government there, Conservative government, introduced the 10-level curriculum, and they specified a standard for each of the 10 levels, and they required teachers to assess their students against them. And then they should report the results, and schools were appropriately named and shamed. It was a pretty controversial project at the outset, but they got away with it. Meanwhile, in the USA, the schools in Kentucky and Texas were subjected to a similar sort of scheme where the results were reported in the media, and it wasn't long before other states started to follow suit, and as you've heard just recently, they've got all states to come together in a common core curriculum, which has recently been endorsed by Andrzej Schleicher and other OECD people. Now, next was Sweden. Sweden got involved in 1993. They're following a very similar policy to our national standards. That is, they don't call them OTJs, overall teacher judgments, but they are using internal assessment to assess their students against their standards, and those are reported in the media. The Netherlands, they started their scheme about the mid-90s. Ontario got the bug in 1993. The province of Ontario was separate from the others. Australia started in 1989 in Queensland. They set up standards there and tried to get away from any sort of norm referencing, just standards-based assessment, and they were followed very soon after by New South Wales, Victoria, and gradually all the states followed suit. New Zealand was relatively late in the process, but our model initially was very similar to Britain's, and NCA was not actually established until 2002. So they took a little bit longer to bite, but every one of them has shown a decline in PISA scores between 2000 and 2012 in all 3 subjects. That is maths literacy, reading literacy, and scientific literacy. Here are some examples. Here are the declines in PISA maths for all the nations that used high-stakes standards-based assessment between 2000 and 2012. And it's not just our results that count, it's the fact that all 7 of these systems have followed the same trajectory. They've all gone backwards. There's the maths results, there are the reading results, and there are the science results. They've all gone backwards. So think about that for a moment. Is it a coincidence? Well, I don't think so. If just one or two of those countries had shown some gains, I'd be less dogmatic about it. But none of them have shown any of the expected gains in any subject. Now, here is the oft-quoted vision of NZQA that that has spurred their efforts and often appears in their annual reports. New Zealand Qualifications Authority will promote improvement in the quality of education and training in New Zealand. I classify that as one of the least credible sentences in English, along with the checks in the mail and you don't look a day over 40, you know, those sort of tactics. Let's see, as I read it, a policy of standards-based assessment plus league tables, as we've adopted in NCA, has had 21 opportunities to show that it is effective in raising achievement levels. That is 7 systems times 3 subjects, and it's failed every time. Now, this is evidence. It's in the public domain. The Minister knows about it because I pointed it out to her in clear graphs. Now, think about this record for a moment. If you invested in a new alarm clock and it let you down once, so you missed an important plane, you'd be disappointed. If it lets you down twice, you'd be upset and you'd probably complain to the manufacturer. But what if you keep trying to make it work and it lets you down 21 times in a row? I suggest that you would be well qualified to become a Minister of Education in a right-wing government. Since I wrote my article in the New Zealand Principal in the March edition, I've been fed some data from Australia by Jeff Masters, whom I've been corresponding with. Jeff is the CEO of the Australian Council for Educational Research, and he was one of the masterminds behind Pisa in the first place. Like me, he's been suspicious of standards-based assessment, and he doesn't like the way the Australians have adopted the NAPLAN plan that Julia Gillard was so keen to get off the ground. So here are the results for each of the Australian states, and they've all gone down the same path. There are declines in PISA maths for the 7, 8 Australian states. There are the declines in PISA reading for the Australian states. And there are the declines in PISA science. There's 1 or 2 exceptions there. The Northern Territory, starting from a very low base with a small sample, they actually improved a little bit. So now, some of you might ask whether any OECD country is showing the opposite trends. Well, I can assure you there are several that are on the up and up, and they've all resisted this toxic combination of standards-based assessment plus league tables. Here are the results for 5 European state nations that are in maths that are not using high-stakes standards-based assessment between 2000 and 2012. And there are the results for the same countries in reading, and there are the same countries in science. So many countries are actually improving, but they're not following our model. Far from it. In fact, most European countries, as far as I can see, have expressly forbidden the use of league tables in their media. They must have strong unions or very well organised QPECs or something in those countries. Now, the question arises, why does a policy of high-stakes standards-based assessment fail on PISA? I should point out that the results I'm talking about don't say anything directly yet about the impact of national standards in primary schools, as the first cohort that suffered under national standards have not quite reached year 11, where the Pisa is operating. But the examples of these other countries should be pretty clear. They don't raise achievement in any of them, whether they're judged by teachers' internal assessments or by tests. Now, when I first started debating the merits of NZQA's proposed scheme for assessment back in 1991, I had 20 criticisms to make of it. And after several exchanges with Alan Barker and David Hood and their staff, they preferred to restrict it to 10. I think they couldn't reply to the others, they were too technical. So I've continued to debate the issues with NZQA, with successive ministers of education, and I've made submissions with other academics to the State Services Commission, to their review committee, and various conferences. But the fundamental flaws, that they have made a few clumsy revisions, I must say, but the fundamental flaws are still there. They're not all of them equally responsible for these declines, but some are just unjust to individual schools and students, or they're wasteful of precious resources. In the article I had published in the New Zealand Principal magazine last month, I spelled out some of the negative consequences of high-stakes standards-based assessment. As high-stakes events, NCA generates more testing, less creative teaching, obvious grade inflation, less stretching of bright students, less cooperation between schools, lower achievement levels, and larger gaps between high and low performing schools. And that's just a start. It always seemed to me that NZQA promised more than they could deliver. They sold the whole scheme on some incredibly naive promises, like the standards will be clearly stated. They aren't. Their teachers would easily be able to tell whether students have reached the standard or not. They don't. That the standards would be applied equally and fairly in all schools. They aren't. That the quality controls of the system would be second to none. They aren't. They promised that all students would earn their credits with no more than 50% of internal assessments. They aren't. That students would be better motivated to work harder when they knew exactly what the actual level required to pass is. They aren't. That teachers would not be excessively lenient when they are pressured by their board and their principal to make their school look good. They are, and so on. Now the Minister thinks that national standards will help reduce the size of the tails of our underachievement so that we bring an end to those nasty inequalities. Well, Pisa shows quite clearly that that's not happening. Now, so why do we have a large tail of underachievement? Partly because many of the lower achieving schools are losing their best students and their best teachers and their morale. When they advertise for more teachers, they have very few to choose from. By contrast, the high achieving schools have lots. That's one reason. Another reason in NCA is the use of these standalone internally assessed achievement standards. When the wording of the standard is vague, as it usually is, it's so easy to fudge things, to mark leniently, push borderline students over the bar, and the literature is full of research and anecdote from overseas about how this happens. The Americans have come up with a list of 13 different ways that teachers typically manage to inflate their scores with one or more of these games. Time doesn't permit me to deal with those. They range from the marginally ethical to the very clearly unethical. Recently, I visited a large secondary school with a college tennis team that I was supervising. I got talking to the head of maths, who told me how well they were doing under NCA, in mathematics particularly. I asked whether they allowed students to take many of the internally assessed achievement standards in maths. And to my surprise, he said, no. Why not? It's too tempting to train kids for the very things you're going to assess and leave out the rest. Regrettably, that was an exception. According to my figures, over 2/3 of NCA credits were gained last year from internal assessments, and the year before it was nearly 70%. Now that doesn't worry NZQA, nor are they worried about the fact that there are already lots of examples of New Zealand teachers gaming the system to make their school look good. If you want examples, just read the PhD thesis of Anne Hume at Waikato University, or read the article in the New Zealand Annual Review, New Zealand Annual Review of 2011 by Dr. Asra Moeed. Here's a brief summary of her research study. She sampled all the teachers of Year 11 science in the Wellington region and made a case study of the science lessons of 10 teachers. She sat and observed, and most teachers, she found, were coaching their students on an internally assessed science investigation, fair testing. So she made a special study of that. And it appears that the students were all being taught to go through a set of hoops. First do this, then do that, then do that, then do that. And then you have repeated examples and mock tests. Nothing very original about it at all. And at the end of this process, they had the formal test for their internal assessment results. And the pass rate was 88%. That's pretty high. By comparison, the exam pass rate of the same students in their other science units was only less than 50%. That's a pretty big discrepancy. No teachers that they interviewed expressed satisfaction with the process. They were making comments like, it just had to be done. I didn't like it, but there was much rote learning and there was a lot of low-level thinking. And one said, lovely, they pass everyone, but I'm not sure I taught them a lot of anything. No wonder their achievement levels are dropping. So, to summarise, why don't our achievement levels rise under NCA with league tables? Here are some of my comments. The defined standards can't cover all aspects of the curriculum. Students neglect the difficult topics or skills, nor those they don't like. Teachers are required to spend more time testing and less on teaching. The students stop studying when they've acquired enough credits to pass. Top students are not strongly motivated by a 4-point scale, hence the big drop in the percentage of top students. Teachers can readily spoon-feed their students to pass the internally assessed units. Visiting moderators rarely know just how much help the students have received for their projects, and failing students are allowed to resubmit after guidance. That I haven't time to go into those, but if I had a bit more time, I'd make some suggestions on what can be done to improve the system, but I think that's a talk for another time. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.